Hello gaming friends, DMSamuel here again, talking to you about Pathfinder. I had a request, and that request was for me to make a video about the basics of the Pathfinder system. So the first thing that you have to know is that Pathfinder 2 is a D20 game. That means that the game relies on the D20 to resolve tasks. What do I mean by that? Well, even at the earliest portions of the book, this here is page 10, even at these earliest portions, what the book painstakingly tells you is that most of the time you're going to be performing actions as your character. Of course, as a role-playing game, you are playing in the role of a character that you've created. Again, I'm not going to talk about character creation, but the idea is, what do you do in the game once you've created your character? Well, you're going to be moving around, exploring things, you're going to be having fights, you're going to be trying to convince people of things, you're going to be doing performances, you're going to be doing all of these things as your character, casting spells and all of that stuff that you do in a typical fantasy RPG. But the question is, well, how do you know when to roll? Well, in general, if you have an assured victory, that is, if there's no chance for you whatsoever to fail a task, then there's no reason to roll. However, sometimes you're going to be trying to perform tasks or achieve goals or overcome a challenge where the outcome isn't necessarily known. And if the outcome is not necessarily known, that's when we leave it up to the dice. And so for that, you're going to roll a check. And that's what it's explaining here in the little part that I highlighted. And the thing is that a check is basically just a D20 roll. But in Pathfinder, how you built your character and what you're doing, that is what circumstances you are encountering and exactly what's going on, could affect anything that you add to that roll in terms of you trying to overcome that challenge. And let me break it down for you. When you make a check, you are rolling a D20 and you are adding the ability modifier for whatever ability is related to what you're attempting to do, and you might be adding some other bonuses. Well, what possible other bonuses are there? Well, for that we have to go to a different section of the book, and we'll learn right here that you can have modifiers from your ability score. You could also have a proficiency bonus. You could also have a circumstance bonus. This circumstance bonus is literally based on what the circumstances are. Okay, you could have an item bonus that is based on something that you are wearing or using or that is available to you. And you can also have a status bonus. Now that's typically going to be something where you're going to have had a spell cast upon you or you're going to have triggered some sort of effect that is beneficial to you. These are all bonuses. Penalties can also occur because of these other things. But before we move on, let me move back to the proficiency bonuses. Proficiency bonuses in Pathfinder 2 come in 5 types. And generally, if you have no sort of training at all, you don't have a proficiency bonus. That is literally one of the types. You are at a 0. You are untrained. Okay? Now, if you are trained in a particular use of an item or in a particular skill, then you will add your level, whatever level you are, whether you're level 1, 15, 12, 10, 20, doesn't matter, you're adding your level, plus 2. Eventually, if you get better and better at that particular item, you might move up to being the rank, proficiency rank of expert, and if you're the proficiency rank of expert, now you add your level, no matter what it is, plus 4, every time you roll. If you are master level proficiency, you'll add your level plus 6, and if you are legendary, you'll add your level plus 8. Not everybody can get to legendary with every skill or ability, and not everybody stays at untrained with every skill or ability, because as your character increases in level, you get certain opportunities to improve things that you are already trained at, or to actually train anew in things that you were not previously trained at. That is the proficiency bonus that will add to your roll. So now here we have the situation where you're rolling a d20, you're adding your level plus your 2, 4, 6, or 8, depending on your proficiency rank, or if you're not trained, then you're just adding 0, not even your level. Okay, but let's say you're an expert at something. You are expert level proficiency at something. So you're rolling a d20, you're rolling your level, you're adding your level. So let's say you're 5th level, d20 plus 5 plus 4. So now you're rolling a d20 plus 9. And now the question is, well, what number are you trying to beat? Well, you are either trying to beat, if you are in combat and you're attacking something, you're trying to beat someone's armor class, let's say. Or if you are trying to perform a skill or attempt a task of some sort, you are trying to beat a difficulty class, which is called a DC. And you are either meeting or beating that number, meeting or exceeding that number. Okay? So if the DC for the task is 15, you are going to try to roll a 15 or higher on your D20 plus 9. That's it. Higher is always better. Okay? And not very many things affect the outcome here. Your proficiency is the biggest thing in a lot of cases, plus circumstance bonuses, item bonuses, and of course some status bonuses. Not everything will always have each of those. Sometimes you'll have some of those and sometimes you won't. Many times you will only have a +1, some sort of status bonus that's only a +1, and that feels very low. But a +1 actually helps you a great deal because of the critical system that is in place in Pathfinder. But I'm going to talk about that later, because first I want to talk about how these roles and this task resolution system integrates with the different modes of play. So if you think about the ebb and flow of the game, one of the things that you'll notice is that you're not always in combat. Although, yes, it's true with a crunchy, really tactically rich game like Pathfinder, you do find yourself in combat a lot, but not always. In fact, when you're in combat, you are in what's called encounter mode. So Pathfinder 2 has 3 modes of play. You have encounter mode, which I just mentioned, which is basically when you're in combat. And in fact, that's really when you are in a situation where every movement counts. So we slow down the time passing to 6-second rounds. So this is your traditional combat that you would find in other fantasy RPGs, okay? And when you are in encounter mode, everything is split into rounds, and you are in imminent danger. Every 6 seconds counts. But when you're not in combat, there are also tasks and abilities that you are using or trying to overcome certain challenges, and in that case, you are now in exploration mode. And when you're in exploration mode, you're not in a 6-second time loop. You're actually in maybe hours, minutes maybe, or hours, and in some cases days, depending. But you may be in danger and you may not. There is the possibility of danger. If you're doing a dungeon crawl style game, of course you're going to be in exploration mode between combats, and you may be in imminent danger as well, or you may feel like you're in imminent danger, but you're not whittling everything down to 6-second rounds. Instead, what you're doing is you're breaking things out into longer periods of time, because the tasks that you're completing are usually 10-minute tasks or 1-hour tasks. Okay? Whereas in combat, the tasks you're completing are 6-second tasks. Now, the third mode of play, the third mode of gameplay, is called downtime. And downtime is what happens when you really aren't in any danger at all, at least none to speak of that you can notice moment to moment. And so therefore this time stretches out into days and even weeks where there's basically no danger, but there are a certain set of different activities that you can perform. In fact, what you can do most of the time depends upon which mode of play that you are in. Now, it's not the case, even though these 3 modes of play exist, it's not necessarily the case that your GM is going to say, okay, you're out of combat, now let's go into exploration mode, what are you doing? You're just going to go with the flow, and there is a narrative flow to the game. You get out of combat, and then you're probably going to start saying, okay, I want to look around, I want to loot the bodies, or I want to heal up my comrades or whatnot. You're not necessarily going to have to wait for the GM to declare that you are in exploration mode, although you could. That's a perfectly fine way of playing. It's not necessarily required, though. But just to understand, the reason that we have these 3 modes of play is because now we can actually tag certain actions and activities with a mode, like exploration mode or downtime mode, that indicates that there's just not enough time for you to perform this task unless you are in an extended downtime. Or there's not enough time during combat for you to perform this task, so we put an exploration tag on it so that you know that it takes a little bit longer than 6 seconds, okay, in order to perform that task. It's an easy way to make sure that certain actions aren't taken advantage of, so to speak. Okay, so let's talk about the next important thing. So those are the modes of play, and since what you can do depends on in a lot of cases what mode of play you're in. Let's talk about combat. Really, what we're talking about is what kind of actions are you doing in combat. So I'll remind you, each combat round is 6 seconds, and you get 3 actions. Okay, you get 3 actions in a combat round, and every action that you have the possibility of doing is listed in the book with some sort of icon. And here is your icon key. It could take a single action, it could take 2 actions, or it could take 3 actions. Okay, and so if you do, you have 3 actions to spend. So if you do a single action activity, you can do 2 more, or you can do a 2 action activity and a single action. So whatever it is, your action count adds up to 3. You can do 1 3-action activity, 3 single action activities, or a 2 action and a 1 action. Okay, you will also get the opportunity to do a reaction, maybe, possibly, depending on circumstances, during the combat round. That's usually something that occurs not during your turn. And then free actions are sometimes things where you are yelling out or providing information. Now that all sounds very complicated, but it's actually very, very simple. You get 3 actions, you also get 1 reaction, and whether something is a free action or not is either explicitly detailed in the rules talking about that action, or it's up to your GM. And that's pretty much how it works. Now, here's the thing about combat. So every turn is 6 seconds, and you roll initiative. And when you roll initiative in Pathfinder 2, there's something interesting that happens. Number one, most people are probably going to be rolling perception as their initiative roll. Now, the thing is, though, that if you were doing something else, something different, some exploration activity that had you focusing on a different type of activity when you were in that exploration mode, it's possible that you're rolling something else for initiative. For example, what if you were sneaking ahead, being kind of scout-like, stealthing ahead, sneaking around, trying to look around a corner or something, and then you find yourself in the middle of combat. Well, when that combat starts, since you were sneaking in the first place, you're probably going to roll stealth for your initiative rather than perception. Or it's possible that you were kind of hanging back and avoiding things and trying to not be seen, and in that case, you also might roll stealth as your initiative. Okay, and so it also could be possible that you were trying to brace yourself to strike an ambush onto someone that you saw was coming down the hall. And in that case, depending on what's going on, if you were, say, trying to plan to leap around the corner or something, you might actually roll acrobatics for your initiative, right? It really just kind of depends on the circumstances. But the point here is that you don't necessarily always have to roll the same thing for initiative. It's not just a dex roll. It's a perception roll, or it could be stealth, or it could be acrobatics, or it could be something else, depending on the activity you were doing right before combat started. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing about initiative is if you tie with another PC, the two of you get to decide who goes first. However, if you tie with a creature, with a foe, that foe gets to go first. So there is no way for a PC to win a tie against an opponent. The opponent always will win. That's just the rule, okay? So what can you do during a combat round? Well, recognize that as I go through these, I'm not going to read everything to you specifically. I want you to recognize, though, that each of these things has a particular number of actions that they will take up in your turn, and they do have specific rules, and they also have tags. These little red marks under the name here, those are tags, and they have meaningful interactions with other particular parts of the rule system. So let's go ahead and run through these, and then I'll explain what some of those interactions are. So you can aid another while you are in a combat round. That's actually a reaction, but in order to do it, you had to prepare to do that during your turn. Okay, and then crawling is a movement that you could perform. It's a 1-action activity. Delaying lets you basically wait until it's a more appropriate time for you to do whatever you had planned to do. Dropping prone, you can just literally fall onto the floor, okay, in a controlled manner. You're not falling and taking damage. Escaping, if you are grabbed or somehow otherwise immobilized, you can attempt an escape there. You can interact with a particular item that's in your hands. You can leap, that is jumping, okay. You can ready an action. Ready in action is a 2-action activity itself, so that means if you spend your turn readying in action to perform that action at a later time based on a trigger that occurs, you can only ready a 1-action activity because you've already spent your 2 of your 3 actions on the readying itself, okay? Releasing something, that is dropping something, is a free action, okay? Seeking means looking around for something, okay? That is a 1-action activity. It has the concentrate tags, which means that you have to be able to concentrate, so you cannot be subject to any effect that doesn't allow you to concentrate. And secret means that the GM rolls that check, so you don't know what your actual die roll result is because the GM is the one rolling it, although they use your numbers, so they'll be using all of your bonuses and everything. And then they'll narrate for you the response based on what your roll was. You'll notice that secret tag in a lot of different areas in this rule set. Sense motive, also a secret one, takes a single action. Standing is just standing up from being prone. Stepping means taking basically a 5-foot step. That is a way to move away from an opponent that does not trigger an attack of opportunity. Stride is basically taking your up to your full movement speed. Okay, it's a movement action. And strike is an attack action. So when you're attacking, you're actually taking the strike action, and it takes 1 action. Now, some classes have other abilities that allow them to make a 2-action strike with different items in it, okay? That still is an attack, okay? And it'll still have the attack tag, just like strike has the attack tag, but this is the sort of generic version of attack. And because it has the attack tag, what that means is it actually triggers a particular effect in the game, and that particular effect is MAP, multiple attack penalty. That is, if you attack once, there's no penalty. If you attack a second time in the same turn, there is a penalty of -5. And if you attack a third time in the same turn, because this attack action is only 1 action, so you could theoretically do it 3 times, it's just that you're going to take a penalty. So the third attack takes a -10 multiple attack penalty. Okay, now if you're using an agile weapon, then that means that it's only going to take a -4 or -8 penalty instead of a -5, -10. But either way, it takes a multiple attack penalty. And the reason that I mention this is because things that apply to the multiple attack penalty calculation have the attack tag. So strike has an attack tag, and escape has an attack tag. So this makes it so that if you're held, you can't escape from being held and then attack twice without incurring a multiple attack penalty. Okay? So you'll also notice, for example, crawl and leap do not have an attack tag, so they do not add to the calculation to figure out if you have to apply a multiple attack penalty. Okay? You can also take cover. And those are all the actions that anyone can do in combat. Okay, anyone can do those previous actions that I just listed. There are some actions that you could perform in combat that are based on your class, okay, that are based on the abilities that your class gives you. And then there are also activities that you could perform given circumstances and given certain abilities. So for example, if you have a fly speed and you are falling, you could actually make the arrest a fall action. You can't do it if you don't have a fly speed, so you can just ignore that ability, right? If you have a burrow speed, you can actually move it, you could actually use it to burrow during your turn rather than use a regular stride action, which is just the walk action, okay? So that's what those are about. And then I just want to point out this attack of opportunity because I mentioned it before, but I really want to spell it out for you this time. The thing that makes this so important is that not everything in the game has it. So if you're used to playing, for example, Dungeons and Dragons, or you're used to playing Pathfinder 1, most of the things in that game, in those games, will attack you if you try to move away from them. Okay? And the thing is that in Pathfinder 2, one of the major changes that has occurred is that not everyone can make an attack of opportunity. Okay, it isn't an ability that everyone gets right out of the gate. In fact, only 2 or 3 classes get it right off of the top. Okay, and then others can possibly take it later. My point here is not everyone has attack of opportunity. What that means is that you're going to be using move actions possibly a lot more than you maybe thought that you were, or maybe that you have in other games. Because if you get locked down in one of those other games, you can't really leave without incurring an automatic attack of opportunity. But here, And so you would have to bend your strategy around that. But here in Pathfinder 2, you don't have that. Not everyone has attacks of opportunity. In fact, it's more the more common situation is those on the battlefield do not have attacks of opportunity at their disposal. So they cannot do those things, okay? They literally cannot perform an attack of opportunity. It is a reaction. It's not an automatic reaction that everyone gets, okay? So in terms of what you're rolling when you make a strike attack, it turns out that a melee attack and a ranged attack roll, those just fall under the regular D20 check rules, except they're basically called specific checks, just as it says right here. This is on page 447 in the core rulebook, and here's what it says. It says a melee attack roll is your D20 plus your strength modifier. If you're using a finesse weapon, you might use your dex modifier, okay? Plus your proficiency bonus. That's your level plus either 2, 4, 6, or 8, depending on what proficiency rank you are. Plus other bonuses and penalties. Those are the things we talked about earlier here. Your circumstance bonus, your item bonus, or your status bonus, okay? And then any penalties, right, that might also incur. Now, what would the penalties be from? Well, if you're in the middle of combat, someone might have cast a spell or something that sickened you, or they might have an aura that sickens you. And if you are sickened, if you are subject to the sickened condition, let's say you're sickened 1, then you get a penalty to -1 to all of your rolls. Okay. And then a ranged attack roll is very similar, except it uses your dexterity modifier instead of your strength modifier, and you add your proficiency bonus, that is 2, 4, 6, or 8, plus your level, and then other bonuses, that is circumstance, item, and status bonuses, and then you add any penalties, and there you go. That's your basic attack roll. It's very, very similar to every other game that you have probably played, if you have played any, in terms of fantasy RPGs. Now, again, here is where it talks about the multiple attack penalty. This is a very important concept, okay? I mentioned it earlier, and it's really important. There's a nice table here that tells us your first attack, second attack, third, or any future attack. 0, -5, -10, or 0, -4, -8. Anything with the attack trait has this applied to it. Okay, anything with the attack trait has this applied to it. So that's pretty much it. That's it for combat. It's relatively simple. The key is in learning what are the actions that are available to you, learning your character and learning what types of abilities that your character is granting to you, and learning when it's a good idea to actually perform those actions. And here's the thing. That's just the basics of combat. And as you play, you'll learn what your character can do, and you'll sort of get the feel for the ebb and flow of everything that's happening, and you'll understand that it's very easy to understand and get used to the actions and the action economy in this particular game. The 3 action economy is just perfect, and it works really, really well. Now, it's also a very brutal game. It's very tactical. And generally speaking, just to point this out, generally speaking, the game expects you to basically heal up between combat. So you want to be healed as much as you possibly can between every combat, because some of the combats are very, very brutal, especially at low levels. Now, in order to heal up, with the exception of certain magical spells or certain different types of feats and abilities, you're going to need to go into exploration mode so that you can spend some time healing. So given that, let's talk about exploration mode. So generally speaking, in exploration mode, you are in the period of time when you are spending most of your time moving around, literally exploring, looking for things, trying to find things out, and role-playing. And so really what you have is a situation where you are possibly in danger, but probably not. And so it turns out there's also a list of exploration activities. Just like there's a list of activities that you could typically be performing during combat, during encounter mode, there are also a list of activities that you can typically perform during exploration mode. Let's talk about some of those. You could avoid notice. Notice it has the expiration tag on it. That means you can't do that during combat or downtime. It's not useful during downtime. And during combat, it doesn't work. So you're using that during exploration. Defend, okay? Detect magic. Follow the expert. Follow the expert's an interesting one. It's when you are performing an activity that maybe one of the PCs, the other PCs in the party is better at, like climbing, okay? The example they give is climbing a surface, right? And if you can see and hear them, because this has the visual an auditory tag on it. If you can see and hear them, you can follow their lead and they can kind of instruct you and help you. As long as they are an expert level or higher in terms of their proficiency rank in whatever it is that the task is that you're completing, they will give you a bonus to your roll. And so you could just be following their lead as you are going through that particular that particular exploration mode activity. You can also increase the amount of movement rate if you're moving over land. That's what the hustle action does. You can investigate things. You can repeat a spell. That is, you can cast a spell repeatedly. Usually you're talking about a cantrip so that it's not burning spell slots. But if you need to cast it, say, 6 or 7 times in a row, you could just do that. Just sort of say, I'm repeating this spell. And so you can do that for 10 minutes at a time. And then it's active for 10 minutes. It's not going to fatigue you. Okay. You can also scout ahead. You can be searching specifically for something, right? Those typical things that you're doing during exploration in a traditional game that you're thinking about. But it turns out, and notice there's no action economy symbols next to these. There's no one action hustle. There's no one action scout, because those aren't encounter activities. So you're not relegated to the 3 action for every 6 seconds. You're now in a wider time space. So it might take 10 minutes or 20 minutes or 30 minutes to do the item that the activity that you're attempting to do. So it's not a 1, 2, or 3 action activity. It turns out also that there are a lot of skills that allow you to perform activities during the exploration phase that are skill tests instead of just generic exploration activities. And that's what this list is over here on the left-hand side. And this is the list of things. Now, not everybody can do all of these. For example, borrowing an arcane spell is what you would do if you're an arcane caster, but if you're a fighter, you're not going to be doing that, right? Coercing is an intimidation skill activity. Covering your tracks is a survival skill activity. Gathering information is diplomacy skill activity. So there's all of these skill activities that you could be doing. And what that means is we need to talk about skills rather than be talking about the exploration phase. Okay, but it was important to put this context on what you're doing during the game when you're using these skills. You're not going to be using gathering information during combat, for example. You're going to use it during an exploration phase or maybe even a downtime phase. Okay, and so let's actually talk about skills, because skill actions can be attempted during the exploration phase. So for this, we need to go to a different part of the book. The skill chapter. So the first thing to know about skills is that every skill has a key ability that you're going to use to add to your roll, right? Your ability modifier to the roll. And your modifier is your key ability plus your proficiency bonus. So again, that's either 2, 4, 6, or 8, or maybe a 0, plus your level if you're proficient in it at all, plus bonuses and penalties. You get the idea. That's the same kind of roll. That is the same generic check that we've been talking about this entire particular video. Okay. And so generally skills are split into 2 groups. They're split into general actions, general skill actions, which are skills that can have actions applied to different abilities, various different abilities. So they're called general skills because you can apply various different abilities to them. And then there are non-general skills. And so let's go through. I'm not going to read every single one of these to you, but I want to also point out that there is this nice table here on page 235. And really what it does is it tells you the skill that's used and what the key ability is. And then it tells you the different actions. So, for example, let's say you're going to try to gather information. You don't say, I use diplomacy. I'm going to go diplomacy that person to ask them questions. You say, I'm going to go try to gather information. I'm trying to do this and that. And or you just say what you're trying to do, and then your DM or GM will say, oh, you're going to try to gather information. I need you to make me a charisma gather information check, right? And how do I know that as the GM? Because if you look at diplomacy here, that's the skill that is being used. So that's what determines whether you're trained, what your training rank is, because you get your training ranks in these different skills, okay? The ability is determining what ability modifier you're adding to that role. So it's charisma in the case of diplomacy. And then there are some things you can do untrained. So even if you're not trained in that particular skill, you can still attempt to perform that task, although you don't get to add your level or any proficiency bonus to it. And then there are trained actions that you can only do if you have some sort of training. Okay? And so let's take a look at just a couple of examples of this. So we're going to look at, because I pointed it out, that diplomacy. So let's go down here and find diplomacy, and what you're going to see is here's diplomacy. This tells us that it's a charisma-based skill, and what you can do with diplomacy is you can gather information, or you can make an impression, okay, or you can make a request, all right? And so that's what you're going to do with diplomacy. Now these are untrained, so you don't even have to be trained in order to do these. You'll notice also gather information is a secret roll, which means because it has that secret tag, the GM is going to be the one rolling it, and then they will tell you the results based on the roll, but they'll be using your modifiers for the roll. So let's take a look at this. So diplomacy uses the charisma ability, so you're going to use your charisma ability modifier, right? And you're using diplomacy as the skill, so you're making a diplomacy skill check, but you're gathering information, and so you're canvassing local markets, taverns, and gathering places in an attempt to learn about a specific individual or a topic. The GM will determine the DC, that's your difficulty class, and the amount of time it takes, usually roughly 2 hours, sometimes more, sometimes a little bit less, along with any benefit that you might be able to gain by spending coins on bribes, drinks, or gifts. Okay, so if you succeed at your check, you collect the information about the individual or the topic, and the GM gives you the specific information. If you fail, you collect incorrect information, and the GM gives you the information. Because it's a secret roll, you don't actually know whether you failed or not, so you have to take that information at face value, because you wouldn't necessarily know as the PC whether that information was true or not. Okay? Now, here's the thing. There are also skill feats that can change or affect how this skill is used. So in this situation, you're using diplomacy, which is a charisma-based skill, to gather information. But what if you're not very good at diplomacy, but you are pretty good at intelligence? Well, it turns out that if we look in the feat section, there is a skill feat called Streetwise, which we can come to here. And Streetwise is a first level feat, and if you are trained in society is a skill, okay? If you're trained in society, you know about life on the streets, and you can use your society modifier instead of your diplomacy modifier to gather information. That's if you have this feat. Not just anybody can do that. If somebody says, well, I grew up in the big city, so I should be able to do that. No, that's not how Pathfinder works. You have to have this feat in order to do that. But then the feat lets you do it, and you have now something that no one else has. You have an ability that nobody else has. This, again, is a skill feat. It's a level 1 feat. You have a prerequisite of being trained in society, but if you take that feat, then you will be able to make your gather information checks without having to worry about pumping up your charisma. If you're a really high intelligence character, but not a high charisma character, then this is very helpful if you're going to be the person who's kind of the face of the party or who does a lot of research and gets information, right? And so society is an intelligence-based skill. Diplomacy is a charisma-based skill. So in other words, even though there are skills that it says you have to be trained or you can be untrained, but you're using a particular skill, there are often ways around that, and those ways are often built into skill feats. Let's look at another example. So if we look at the medicine skill, medicine is a wisdom-based skill, and you patch up wounds and help people recover from diseases and poisons. If you're untrained, you can use medicine to recall knowledge, to find out something about someone else, and you can administer first aid, which basically lets you stabilize someone who went down, but doesn't really heal anything. Okay, it just lets you stabilize them at 0 hit points. If you are trained in medicine, you have the option to treat a disease, treat poison, or treat wounds. Treat wounds is a really good one because that's one of the ways that I mentioned earlier that at the end of combat, it's kind of expected that you're going to use time to heal up. Well, that's exactly what treat wounds does. You spend 10 minutes, you treat an injured living organism, usually another PC, but sometimes it's an animal or whatever. Okay, could be an NPC. And then you heal them up some amount of hit points, and that's based on how well you succeed or if you fail that check. Okay, now that's treat wounds and medicine. And so that is going to be a wisdom check, right? There's also a skill feat that will allow you to change a little bit about how this works. Okay, and so if we look on a different page here in the skill chapter, you can see that continual recovery here is a 2nd level feat. You have to be an expert in medicine, so you have to not only be trained, but you have to be bumped up in proficiency rank to expert, because remember it goes trained, expert, master, legendary. So you have to be an expert to take this. Okay, and basically it's a general feat, but it's a skill feat, and it says you monitor the patient's progress to administer treatment faster. When you treat wounds, that is that skill that we were just talking about, your patient becomes immune for only 10 minutes instead of 1 hour. This applies only to your treat wounds activities, not that any other patient receives. So let's go back and take a look at that. So what does this mean? What benefit is this of every 10 minutes? Well, it turns out that when you look at treat wounds, it says when you treat somebody's wound, they are now immune to treat wound actions for an hour. So you can only treat wounds on someone once per hour. Okay? And on the other hand, then if you get to 2nd level and you take that continual recovery feat, now it's only every 10 minutes. So every 10 minutes you can attempt to heal them even more. So you could see what a huge benefit that is. Now that is an example of a skill feat that affects the way that a skill works. In this case, a trained skill action, but also it didn't change the ability or skill that you actually use. Whereas in the diplomacy example, we switched it from diplomacy to society. So as you can see, there's a lot of little interactions in here that can occur between skill actions and skill feats, and it just depends on how you build your character to make that happen. Okay, one of the important things that I wanted to make sure I covered was secret checks in here. Okay, and secret checks are important, but I do want to point out that every ability, maybe with the major exception of Constitution, has some untrained and trained actions. So if you think about the skill list here, and you look at the key abilities, you get every ability except for Constitution. Okay, and every one of these has several untrained actions, and a few, in some cases a lot, of trained actions, some only a few. Okay, some have no trained actions here. So diplomacy doesn't have any trained actions, right? But crafting has several trained actions. Okay, athletics has a lot of untrained actions, but a few, one trained action. Now, these untrained actions sometimes are things you can do in combat, right? Or while combat is occurring when you are in encounter mode. So, for example, shove. Let's take a look at shove, which is an athletics skill. Okay, if we look at shove, it's right here. You have at least one hand free. The target can't be more than one size larger than you. You can push them away from you by making an athletics check against your target's fortitude DC, so you're not aiming for their AC. However, it does have the attack trait, which means if you use one of your actions to shove them during an encounter, it impels that multiple attack penalty. Okay, so even with these skill actions, you also have to look to make sure that what you're doing, what kinds of tags it has. Swim is a move action, of course, that makes very much sense. Disarm is an attack action, so it will imply or it will cause that multiple attack penalty to kick in. Okay, and so that is a little primer on skills and checks. Now, One thing that I've kind of mentioned a couple of times, but just really skirted over in this video so far, is the critical system. I talked about, well, if you succeed or you critically fail or whatnot. So let's actually talk about this system in a little bit of detail. So let's talk about the critical system, because it is a very refined, very cool part of Pathfinder 2 that I personally love, that makes the game feel very dynamic, and it makes it have an edge of your seat quality sometimes. It also is the thing that makes just a tiny +1 bonus so very important. So let's talk about critical hits and critical successes. Basically, that's what this section here is talking about when it says the degree of success and what the effect of that degree is. So here's the thing. When you make a check, you are rolling and you're having a number on the die. You're adding your modifiers. You're adding any bonuses and any penalties, and that's going to give you the result. Okay, that's what's in this giant red box down here. And that's all well and good. We already know all that. But what does it mean by degree of success? Well, what it means is, if you are attempting a task, you are trying to meet or beat a difficulty class, a DC, okay? And when you roll that check, if you meet or beat the DC, then you have succeeded. If you beat the DC by 10 or more, you have critically succeeded. Okay, so if the DC is 15 and you roll a 25, that is all total with all your bonuses and everything, you roll a 25 or higher, you critically succeeded. And that's important in combat for critical hits, because critical hits do double damage. So you roll your damage, multiply it by 2. But it's not only important in combat, because in Pathfinder 2, there also are often effects that are different based on whether you critically succeeded at a task or not. Okay? So some skills, if you critically succeed, it does something more for you than just succeeding. Or if you have a saving throw that you are attempting, if you critically succeed on your saving throw, basically what that means is you avoid any effect. If you succeed, you might save for half, right? If you fail, you might take full damage. If you critically fail, though, it's really bad, so you might take double damage. So there are 4 levels of success there. Okay, there's 4 levels of success. Okay, so if your DC is 15, you roll a 25 or higher, you've critically succeeded. If your DC is 15, you roll a 5 or lower, you've critically failed. The things in between, below 15, is a failure. Above 15, but not to 25, that's a success. Here's the thing. So does a nat 20 have any effect then, since we're talking about +10 or -10 causing you to crit succeed or crit fail? Well, here's the thing. If you roll a natural 20, even if you didn't succeed on the roll, it actually bumps it up 1 step, so it will become a success, just not a critical success. And if you did succeed, it will become a critical success, even if you didn't actually get 10 over. If you roll and you roll a natural 1, it actually steps you back down 1. So even if you rolled a 1, even if you still hit the thing, it now actually becomes a failure instead of a success. Or if you rolled a 1, but it still critically succeeded at that task, it would actually come back and become a full success rather than a critical success, because it knocks you down 1 step. So you can imagine this as kind of a 4-step pyramid where you've got critical failure at the bottom, the next step up is failure, the next step up is success, and the step above that is critical success. And so rolling a natural 20 will move you, after you've calculated whether you hit or missed officially, it will move you up 1 step. And the 1 will move you down, the 20 will move you up. Oh, one thing I want to mention that is something that's a little bit different from say, 5th edition D&D, and that is 5th edition D&D has this mechanic called advantage and disadvantage, where if you have some sort of circumstance that gives you an advantage in that particular whatever activity is occurring, you get to roll 2 dice and take the highest, or if you have disadvantage, you roll 2 dice and take the lowest. That really doesn't exist very commonly in Pathfinder 2. So in Pathfinder 2, it's not called advantage, disadvantage. It's called fortune and misfortune. And ultimately, there are very, very few things that apply a misfortune or a fortune onto a particular event. There are a few feats and a few sort of class abilities that open up different actions that allow you to do this. Devise a stratagem is one in the Advanced Player's Guide, I think. Ultimately, it doesn't happen very often. It's definitely not as often as what you would find in something like 5th edition D&D, because in 5th edition D&D, it is the main mechanic that you use to change the probabilities of whether something is easier or more difficult. In Pathfinder 2, it's not the main mechanic to determine the ability to succeed or fail in a particular mechanic. The main mechanics there are what's in this red box on the screen. It's the ability modifier that you have, your proficiency bonus, the circumstance bonuses, the status bonuses, and the item bonuses, and then any penalties that apply maybe in those groups. Now, the thing is that proficiency bonuses, you're only going to have one. You're either untrained, so you have none, or you're trained, expert, and then master or legendary. You're not both. You're not trained and expert, so you don't get to add any bonuses together. There's just one proficiency bonus that you get or don't get, as the case may be. Circumstance bonuses don't stack. You just take the highest one. Status bonuses don't stack. You just take the highest one. Item bonuses don't stack. You just take the highest one. And by the same token, circumstance penalties, status penalties, and item penalties don't stack. Okay, so you just take the worst one, but untyped penalties do stack because they don't have a type. So sometimes you'll get hit with several effects. If those are all circumstance penalties, well, then you only take the worst one. But if they're all untyped, they will all apply. Okay, but notice there's no advantage, disadvantage in there. There's no fortune, misfortune in there because that really doesn't exist. It's not something that is used very often, if at all, okay, in this game. It is a mechanic in there, and it does apply to a few, sort of side edge cases, right? I know there's ways to bring it in. Don't send me emails about it, okay? I know. But I'm just for a newer player, it's probably it's not going to come up. You have to build a very specific build with very specific choices to make that even happen, okay? Other than that, I think we've basically covered everything, all of the basics for how to play this game, for how this game works, how the D20 rolls work, how checks work, how critical successes and failures work. And so I think I'm done with this video. So if anybody has any other requests, please let me know. I hope that you enjoyed this. I hope it is helpful and that you could actually present it to your players as here's why we should play this, because it sounds really, really fun. And otherwise, I'll talk to you later.